Last month, I preached on the resolution toward an anti-racist Unitarian Universalist association that was passed by an almost unanimous vote of some 3,000 congregational delegates to the 1997 UUA General Assembly. Noting that it had been 25 years, I lamented that we don't have much to show for it, which is why I believe so many congregations are now adopting the proposed eighth principle out of a desire to do something about our commitment to anti-racism. In that sermon, though, I didn't say much about why I think we have not otherwise made much progress to become an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural faith. I think there are three main reasons why we haven't done more in those 25 years. The first reason is white fragility. The anti-racism trainings that congregations hosted, starting in the 1990s with creating a Jubilee world and then Jubilee 2, which I took almost 20 years ago, those trainings simply didn't account for white fragility and for how much pushback it would generate. These trainings were intended to present an analysis of structural racism that was a consequence of combining prejudice with power, with the consequence that our society has built-in systems that give unearned privileges to white people. However, the message that came across was that white people are racists. Not surprisingly, when white people who are new to conversations about race and racism are presented with that declaration, their defenses go up. And yes, I experienced that defensiveness too, as I tried to understand what we were being told. And I recognize that I still experience it when I find myself yearning to effectively dilute the point I'm trying to make by saying that, yes, our society also gives unearned privileges to men and to able-bodied people and to straight people, and particularly to wealthy people. And I have to remind myself that we're talking about race right now. Distracting us from the point is one of the things that white fragility does. Nowadays, thankfully, we have the work of Robin DiAngelo and others who have named white fragility as a range of defensive responses, such as anger, guilt, deflection, distraction, silence, and simply leaving the conversation, that serve to reinstate white racial equilibrium. And we must account for white fragility, because any effort to institute anti-racism that does not account for it will fail. Speaking of which, there was also, second, theological confusion about what we were doing, as demonstrated by the Rev Tandaka in her 1999 lecture and essay, Why Anti-Racism Will Fail. It immediately attracted the attention of people opposed to doing anti-racism, white fragility at work, especially since this was a black woman criticizing what her fellow UUs were trying to do to white people. Tandaka's primary complaint was that the anti-racism trainings violated our first principle. Specifically, Tandaka claimed telling white people that they are racist goes against our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of all people. However, this is the fallacy, as I talked about in another sermon last month, of confusing individual behavior, our ways of being in the world, both how we act on the world as well as how the world acts on us, with individual worth. The first principle says we have inherent worth and dignity. It does not say we behave perfectly and never mess up. Nor does the fact that we make mistakes or benefit from injustice mean that we're bad people. We are not Calvinists. In other words, Tandaka incorrectly assumed that when white people are told that we benefit from a racist system, that means that we're indicted as, in her words, helpless, passive sinners. Rather, the point of the anti-racism trainings is to help us wake up, Recognize that our actual place in society is not what society has tricked us into believing it is, and then motivate us to do something about it. The third reason why we haven't made much progress toward anti-racist Unitarian Universalism is, I believe, what self-declared policy wonk Heather McGhee has called the myth of the zero-sum game. Let me demonstrate this. In their report, Widening the Circle of Concern, the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change has a chapter on reparations. And one of the recommendations they make in that chapter is as follows: channels and procedures for identifying harm, making amends, and financial reparation should be established. Throughout US history, institutions have been built upon an economy that used stolen lands and slave or indentured labor to transfer resources to a small group that became wealthy. One result of this systematic exploitation is that communities of color in general have fewer resources than other communities. And one action that the Commission recommends is to study the reparations movement and examine its implications for institutions at all levels of Unitarian Universalism. Now, if even this mild talk of reparations made certain parts of your body clench, you are not alone, because that's the myth of the zero-sum game at work. Intellectually, I agree with the need for reparations, but I admit that I've felt a sense of unease in my gut that I didn't fully understand until I read Heather McGhee's recent book, The Sum of Us. McGhee writes that the myth of the zero-sum game tells us that one group can only get ahead if another group suffers. When it comes to reparations, the myth of the zero-sum game tells us that progress for what people of color means a loss for white people. Yes, it is true that the history of the US includes the transfer of natural resources and the benefits of labor from Black people, indigenous people, and people of color to a small group of affluent white people who became even wealthier in the process. But no, it is not true that to rectify this through reparations or any other mechanism will indiscriminately hurt white people in order to make people of color better off. The myth of the zero-sum game wants you to believe that, oh, I don't know, the woke police will come into white people's houses and take your stuff to give it to people of color instead. But that's not how reparations work. So please, unclench. I strongly recommend McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, as well as her TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone. Now, there was one comment in Tandaka's misguided criticism of UU anti-racism programs that was correct, when she named as an errant assumption that white America works for white Americans. And that's what McGhee talks about when she points out that racism is bad for white people too. And to be clear, racism is really bad for people of color. Racism is killing people of color. McGhee is African American, so she knows that. Her point is that racism isn't actually good for most white people either. McGhee starts making her case by talking about the taxpayer-funded public amenities that used to exist in the US, particularly across the South in the 1930s and 40s. Towns even competed to see who could have the best public parks, and nothing was better than a swimming pool that families could enjoy on hot summer days. White families, that is, even though the parks and pools were funded by taxpayers paid by all of the town's citizens. But when segregation was challenged in court, when it was ruled unconstitutional, do you think the towns did the right thing and opened the taxpayer-funded swimming pools to everyone in the community? No, they didn't. Rather than letting Black families come swim too, they drained the pools and filled them in. Since the towns didn't want black people to enjoy something, even if they had a right to enjoy it, white people weren't allowed to enjoy it either. McGee's point, racism is bad for white people too. Or to take a more recent example, remember the subprime mortgage crisis that crashed the economy 15 years ago? You might think that that was merely something crazy and unexpected that the big banks did, but it was entirely intentional. The banks already knew that subprime loans were hugely profitable, even as they ruined borrowers, because they first experimented on black and brown homeowners, even those with good credit who should have qualified for prime loans. It was a modern-day form of redlining, designed to extract the hard-won wealth of people of color, but ultimately hurting all of us when the economy crashed. Of course, categorizing black and brown people as risky borrowers made it harder for policymakers to see what was going on before it was too late. But that stereotype is nothing new. It's also part of how overt racial discrimination, such as segregation, became sanitized and built into oppressive systems that on their face have nothing to do with race, even though they are thoroughly racialized. Just consider what Lee Atwater, strategist for Presidents Reagan and George Bush I, admitted on the record in 1981. And here I'm going to change one of his words that Atwater used rather than quote him verbatim. He said, you start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, but a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. The policy decisions, in other words, are about taxes and crime, because it's politically correct to talk about economics and social issues rather than race. But as McGee repeatedly documents, the hollowing out of the middle class has hurt white people more. Cutting social programs, attacking welfare, refusing Medicaid expansion, restricting drug treatment options, threatening reproductive rights, allowing infrastructure to decay, undermining public education, even denying global climate change. They are all modern versions of filling in public swimming pools, refusing to allow people of color to benefit from society's goods and services, even if it means white people lose them as well. Racism is bad for white people too. Which brings me to the reflection on Billy Taylor's I Wish I Knew How by the Reverend Kimberley Debus, and her assertion that white people don't know what it's like not to be free. To which I find myself responding, okay, that's true. But on the other hand, do we actually know how it does feel to be free? In this racist society where the racism is built into oppressive systems that are not overtly about race, even though they are thoroughly racialized, I don't think we do know how it feels to be free. That's why, oh no. So let me explain why I say this. Some years ago, I created an exercise to explore what I called secret privilege. I had come to the conclusion that while systems of oppression were, of course, obvious to those who were oppressed, they were largely invisible to those who were not, because whatever privilege they were receiving was simply seen as normal. That's why feminist scholar and anti-racism activist Peggy McIntosh talks about the collection of social benefits afforded to white people as the invisible knapsack of white privilege. There have been many demonstrations of this in TV shows and academic studies where two people, one black and one white, have been in the exact same situation, with everything else about them being identical, even down to the clothes that they're wearing. But the white person gets the loan or the job or the apartment, and the black person doesn't. For the black person who experiences what the white person experienced, what the black person experiences, it's obviously unfair. They've been denied the loan, the job, the apartment, solely because of their skin color. For the white person who experiences what the white person experiences, it's entirely unremarkable. If you're qualified for the loan, the job, the apartment, why wouldn't you get them? That's how it ought to be. But that's not how it is for the black person. So I created an exercise asking each person in a group to make a list of their personal attributes as they thought of them, and to place each of those attributes in one of three categories. Does society seem to view the person or treat them negatively because of that attribute? Does society seem to view them or treat them positively because of it? Or does society seem to be neutral? After everybody in the group has listed their attributes and categorized them, then they compare their lists with one another. In my experience, people tend to be more aware of the attributes for which society views them or treats them negatively. Women are more likely to name gender as an attribute than men. People of color are more likely to name race as an attribute than white people. We are, after all, more aware of the ways in which society views or treats us badly, while neutral or even positive treatment fades into our background sense of what is normal. Then, and the more diverse the group is, the better this works, some people might realize that they need to move some of their attributes from the neutral category to the positive. When women share that gender is in their negative category, men who were not already aware of male privilege might now realize that gender is positive for them, not neutral. When people of color share that race is in their negative category, white people who were not already aware of white privilege might now realize that race is positive for them, not neutral. That's how, in fact, Peggy McIntosh realized that she was a beneficiary of the invisible knapsack of white privilege, after realizing that she did not benefit from the invisible knapsack of male privilege. This is just one reason why group diversity matters, because the people who have attributes in the negative category are better placed. They have what liberation theology calls the preferential option to see what attributes bring benefits or not, enlightening those with positive attributes that not everyone shares their privilege, nor is it universally normal. But it should be. In case the word privilege makes you think we're talking about special benefits, like free big screen TVs or flying first class or having a chauffeur, well, no, we're not. Most of the time, being privileged by sexism or racism simply means we're not being oppressed by sexism or racism. We need to stop thinking of privilege as something special that could be taken away in order to make other people equal. That's the myth of the zero-sum game talking again. Rather, the privilege of not being oppressed should be normal for everyone. And this brings us back to the subject of freedom. A person of color is aware of how they are oppressed by racism, how they have been prevented from getting the loan, the job, or the apartment when an otherwise identical white person gets them. In fact, it doesn't need to be an identical white person. White high school graduates, for example, have higher average household wealth than black college graduates. White high school dropouts have higher average household wealth than black college graduates. So of course, a black person is aware that they are not free, both in how society treats them now and in how they are suffering the consequences of past racism that prevented their family from building generational wealth, such as the ways the New Deal in the 1930s and the GI Bill in the 1940s excluded Black people from their benefits. For white people, by contrast, there's a weird tension. On the one hand, what freedom we enjoy from racism, if we are even aware of it, is merely how it ought to be. On the other hand, most of us are hurt by those modern versions of filling in public swimming pools too, and that's certainly not freedom. As Tandaka noted, white America doesn't work for most white Americans. As McGee puts it, racism isn't actually good for most white people. Racism is America's soul sickness, and given that it ultimately denies everyone's humanity, I don't think we do actually know how it feels to be free. Let me share a brief anecdote that, when I remembered it recently, helped me realize this. The Jubilee 2 training I took almost 20 years ago was led by two UU ministers, one Black and one white, the Reverend Josh Pawalik and the Reverend Mel Hoover. At one point in the training, and I think this was unscripted, Pawalik, who is white, asked the all-white group of UUs what we enjoy about being white. Very few people could come up with an answer. Then Pawalik asked Hoover, who is Black, what he enjoyed about being Black. And without even pausing to think about it, Hoover answered with a lengthy list of everything he liked. The conclusion? Black people enjoy a culture of music and dance and food and clothing and stories and so on and so forth. White people don't. By privileging whiteness as normal and anything else as other, racism denies that white people even have a culture. Fortunately, there are some things we can do about this. First, we white people can face our white fragility. It's our problem, and we need to deal with it. Second, we can get clear on our theology. We can believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and we can admit that society is set up with multiple intersecting systems of oppression that benefit some of us, and those two facts are not mutually exclusive. Third, we can debunk the myth of the zero-sum game and instead embrace what McGee calls the solidarity dividend, which are the gains a whole community makes when people come together across race and allow diversity to be a source of synergy. In short, we can focus on liberation. Liberation from our society's soul sickness, liberation from the dehumanization of racism, liberation from politicians who would use fear of difference to divide us, liberation from the despair of isolation. In that vein, I'm going to conclude with a short poem by my colleague, the Reverend Teresa Soto. It is called "To the People Who Have Mistaken Freedom for Liberation." To be free, you must embrace the breadth of your own existence without apology, even if they try to take it from you. You must know, not that you can do whatever you want. You are not a kudzu vine, eating entire hillsides for the purpose of feeding your own lush life. You must know instead that inside you are entire universes, milky blue, magenta, and gold, expanding. But to actually be free, you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside of everyone else. Being free is not a license, but a promise. May it be so.